Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion. Climate change is one of the key threats that hangs over the lives of low-income families and households. It affects everyone, but not everyone in the same way. Today's session, Leaving No One Behind, an intersectional approach to digital green inclusive finance, we will talk about the opportunity for addressing climate change through digitally inclusive green finance and how we can ensure that the outcomes protect the most vulnerable, women who are often more disproportionately affected by climate change. We have with us a really exciting group of speakers who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves, and they represent a variety of stakeholders working at this intersection of green inclusive finance, off-grid energy, and gender. So maybe I will start with Marcida.
Okay, I had the feeling you would start with me. Thank you, Nisha, for the introduction. Hello also to fellow panelists. My name is Marcida Rada. I am actually a climate change lawyer by default. So climate change is something that I've been dealing with for a very long time now, but with a huge passion for solar. In my current role, I'm an advisor within GIZ Energizing Development in Uganda. NDEF promotes clean energy solutions in more than 20 countries. In Uganda, we focus on different technologies, which is solar, cooking energy, and then we focus also those two technologies, cooking energy and solar, in refugee and host communities. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here and be with you in this session.
Great, thank you, Marcida. Alison, I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Alison Bass, and I'm the head of credit operations for NG Energy Access. NG has 9 different markets where we have a vertically integrated solar home system and PAYGo company operations. We have financed hundreds of millions in PAYGo loans at this point and hundreds of thousands of customers. So very much at the intersection of financial inclusion and clean energy solutions. And I'm really excited to also speak a little bit about the gender lens and how that factors into financial inclusion industry and the energy sector as well.
Thanks, Alison. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Nisha. Thank you so much for having me on. My name is Dan Waldron. I'm the head of insights at Acumen. Acumen is a non-for-profit social venture fund, does a range of activities, including on sort of leadership and education, but particularly we're most known for raising philanthropic and grant funds to invest them as debt and equity in companies that are solving problems of poverty, including such as NG Energy Access, so that's another portfolio of ours. In addition to that, we've also raised and spun off a number of for-profit funds. A lot of this focused in the energy access space. It has been Acumen's largest and I can say probably most successful portfolio to date, going back to 2007 when we made a small investment in a company called D-Light, to today, all told, we have 40 different companies across the portfolio pursuing energy access in a number of different ways. So excited to talk about this.
Great, thank you so much. So before we get started with our discussion and talk for the next 30 to 40 minutes, I wanted to start with a quick poll and for the framing of this discussion. So if I can ask the organizing team to put up the first poll, you should see it in where you see the chat. There'll be an option for poll. The first question is the number of people around the world who lack access to electricity are, and we have 4 options for you. So 1.2 billion people, 700 million people, 365 million people, or less than 100 million people. Let's see if we can get some numbers on the poll. Any respondents? Let's see. I see a few responses coming in, and we'll close it shortly to see what the audience thinks this number is. Can we close it? Okay, so half of the respondents thinks it's about 57%, sorry, 1.2 billion people. Okay, that's a little higher. It's not as bad as that. The correct answer is 700 million people, which about 30% of our audience got. So yeah, it's not as large of a problem, but you know, we're just talking about basic electricity access, and this number is very nuanced. And the reason that access to electricity is important, especially for women, we have seen research that it helps with improving school attendance for girls and for, in the long run, for women's employment opportunities. There's a piece of research from Brazil that shows girls in rural areas with access to electricity are 59% more likely to complete primary education by the time they're 18 years old. It also, helps women have more time for productive use and creates opportunities for increasing income. The next question that you'll see, there's a second poll that we'd like you to respond to. How many people around the globe still use solid fuels such as wood, crop waste, charcoal, coal or dung, and kerosene in open fires and inefficient stoves? Is it 640 million? Is it 1.6 million, 2.4 million, or 3.2 million? So let's see, I see some responses coming in. Okay, it's pretty evenly split between the people who voted now. I'm still seeing some more come in. Okay, can we close it? Sorry. And let's see what the final number looks like. So it's looks like, again, in this case, we underestimate how many people cook with solid fuels. It's actually 2.4 million. That's a very large number. And this is especially relevant to women because, as we know, because of gender norms, this is a primary responsibility that women are in charge for. Inefficient cook stoves take a lot of time. Women spend on an average 10 hours a week collecting firewood if they're using solid cooking, solid wood for cooking, which means they can't use that time for anything else. It also has extremely detrimental health outcomes because of the pollution that it produces. Okay, the third poll. Very quickly, this is a statement, and it should be really easy for you to answer. In developing countries, lack of access to energy is an obstacle to women and girls' well-being and economic opportunities. True or false? Okay. I see some responses, and as I said, this was an easy one. It's sort of an obvious answer after the previous two questions. If we can close the poll. So yes, this is true. Access to energy is a very important aspect of women's economic opportunities and economic advancement. Which brings me to today's session and why we are having this discussion. If we can close the poll and move on. I'm going to ask a colleague of mine to quickly share his screen with the only slide we will present during this session. This session is convened on behalf of GIZ as they're interested in exploring scalable solutions to address the twin challenges of climate change and gender equality and the role of inclusive finance in achieving this. This is driven by Germany's new development policy, namely the feminist development policy and ensuring a just transition, which prioritizes a focus on the world's most vulnerable groups, one of which is women, and seeks to equip them with the right tools to better weather current hardships and enhance their resilience against unexpected shocks, both economic and climate related. In today's session, we are building on CFI's Green Inclusive Finance Framework, which was presented about a year ago at the Financial Inclusion Week, and we're complementing it with a stronger emphasis on digitalization and intersectionality to conceptualize an integrated approach with greater reach and scalability. So the CFI Green Inclusive Finance Framework argued that green inclusive finance can provide a range of diverse financial tools that can help low-income people and communities reduce their vulnerability and make investments to improve, their own outcomes in the context of climate change. One significant area that we see as an opportunity is off-grid solar products and services. As the poll showed, 700 million people live without access to electricity. And clean energy underpins many technologies and solutions for climate change mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and transition. So it's a huge opportunity for achieving the climate-related outcomes that are outlined in the Green Inclusive Finance Framework. At the same time, access to light and power is, a key element for women's economic empowerment and for them to be able to realize, more financial opportunities, productivity and income, health and well-being, and access to education and information, which you'll see is on the right side of the framework. This is based on work CGAP has done to conceptualize a theory of change on how off-grid technologies through the use of PAYGo can create better outcomes for women. So the focus of today's discussion is what is the opportunity for women to use PAYGo and PAYGo-based off-grid solutions and productive use technologies to capture opportunities, build resilience, improve outcomes for themselves, and also how all of this contributes to climate change impact pathways. So there's multiple frameworks that we're meshing here. And to make all of this a little bit more tangible and real, we have our panelists who will help us walk us through this complicated landscape. Maybe I will start with a question for Marcida about where does she see in NDEV's work the opportunities for realizing these outcomes around women's financial inclusion and economic opportunities, but also climate change impact through PAYGo.
Okay, thank you, Nisha. Maybe I sort of draw a bit the bigger picture within NDEV. So in NDEV, leave no one behind, and also the climate change energy nexus is very important. Specifically, we are now, as a key element to NDEV's overall strategy, we're recalibrating our projects altogether, including the leave no one behind aspect, specifically looking into gender as one of the focus areas, but also refugees, poorest of the poor, to just name some examples, what we actually mean by LNOB. And I think in our overall portfolio, we contribute substantially in specifically greenhouse gas emission reductions through our project. I think I spoke already a little bit about the technologies with our results-based financing model, where we work with private sector and sort of promote the distribution of those technologies, clean technologies, or improved technologies in terms of improved cook stoves. I think this is like the main entry point, but also we have projects around solar powered irrigation, where also women are substantial next to the cooking bit, where, as you said, social norms sort of dictate for women to basically cover this aspect of their daily life. So in solar irrigation, we have, for instance, in Uganda, where I work in, we were currently partnering with a women's group that will basically work with women, demonstrate the SPI, what we call the solar powered irrigation system, to basically be able to irrigate their land, but also produce excess produce. So they can basically not only do subsistence farming, but also be able to sort of sell their extra produce in the market. On PAYGo and solar, we see also an adaptation element because obviously with the kid being very sort of mobile, you can also sort of when extreme weather shocks hit, and we have seen it in the past, floods in multiple parts of Uganda, it's something that will generate energy regardless. It's independent from the grid, so the unreliable grid aspect becomes a huge issue. But also, if, let's say, your main energy source is hydro, and if you have also droughts in different parts of the country, I think this is where the adaptation element of solar technologies come in that sort of regard. But also for productive use, we have seen that solar contributes to longer working hours in shops, in tailor shops. So this is typically what is done by women under the term of productive use. So there are different sort of elements there that favor women in terms of income generation, so better economic standing, but also in terms of climate resilience.
Great, thanks. I think the point you made about the mobility of the unit and in the context where people might be having to migrate, it is a very important one. Also, the unreliability of the grid. We know that about almost 50% of the areas where there is grid connectivity, also, it's actually pretty weak. So off-grid technologies are not just for contexts where people don't have any access to the grid. It is a key piece of improving the quality of energy access in cases where there is a weak grid. And that's an opportunity. When the grid is weak, and what gets prioritized in terms of where the energy is used often means women who don't have the ability to make decisions in the household. They are doing more manual labor. So Alison, I will ask you to speak a little bit from the perspective of a PAYGo provider who's, expanded in multiple countries.
Yes, sure. So NG Energy Access, again, we primarily do PAYGo sales of clean energy solutions. Most of these are solar solutions. And most of these are home products, so adding home convenience and comfort, safety and security, moving beyond kerosene and candles and torches to something that can generate clean light and also be used for things like phone charging. Our product range does go up from there to include basic appliances for at the moment, especially entertainment, TV and communication devices are extremely popular. We would love to offer more and more appliances along the lines of refrigerators and units for cold storage, a little bit more around heating as well. But I would say that in general, our core strength has been in figuring out how to finance those entry-level kits in particular for communities who are primarily off-grid. But as you've just said, actually quite a lot of our customers and a growing number of our customers are coming from weak grid areas of the country in which they live, and countries which are fairly notorious for having weak grid, or where recently brownouts, higher rates of tariffs, et cetera, have had an impact on people's ability to access consistent energy sources. We are very interested in getting into more productive use categories. We've had several smaller pilots of things like the solar water pumps and refrigerators now, and a few other types of products, some including in e-mobility. To be honest, this is one that we will need to spend a lot more energy on to figure out what the model is that's really going to work. No pun intended. I saw the nod from Dan there, because really one of the key pieces of this is there's a promise of increased income, and figuring out how to deliver on that increased income in a way that offsets the expenses that you're adding to that household or to that business is very incumbent on it. Something else that I think is exciting about the work that we've done in the past and in partnership with folks like CCAP is around leveraging the financial inclusion for energy to build additional inclusivity for other financial products and services. So we provide education loans in Uganda in particular, and have done for years. It's one of our most popular products in terms of the number of customers who seek it out and receive it. And we're using basically the in-house credit score that our customers have built by paying for their energy product, and using and with the insight that access to education and also with insurance access to health services are key needs of our customers, and especially key needs of women in the households that we serve, have added in these types of financial services. In terms of climate change mitigation, I hope we'll do more in the future around areas of clean cooking. We do a bit of that, but it's not a major portion of our portfolio today. But we are starting to understand a little bit more about what the impact is of even our solar financing by partnering with carbon finance providers who are basically helping us to understand the value creation and the carbon offsets and reduction in carbon emissions. So we'll be looking forward to getting some of those projects launched in a little larger scale, and having a better insight into what even our solar impact has been on emissions reduction.
Great, really exciting to hear about that, especially as a strategy for addressing some of the affordability issues, if that makes sense, using carbon financing for that, because that's been one of the criticisms or challenges, just the cost, if anything, beyond the most basic products for customers. But also really exciting to hear about how you're leveraging the data that is being created to offer, a broad range of services to your customers who definitely value them. So that's really helpful context. I wanted to move one level up and maybe get Dan to talk a little bit about, in his role as an investor, we're seeing this proliferation of PAYGo in certain markets. It's growing rapidly, but it's still concentrated in specific markets. So, what about moving to those areas where there is a very large need, but the lack of some basic infrastructure might be creating challenges for, companies like Engie to move into those markets.
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. It's something we think about a lot. And I guess just to maybe set a slightly more context, Acumen is not primarily a financial inclusion investor. It's not a pillar of ours. And yet, the last time I looked within our African portfolio, 10 out of our 15 companies offered some kind of direct-to-consumer service. Only 2 of them are actually licensed financial intermediaries, right? But so many of them end up offering that kind of contextual financial inclusion, like what Engie does, which is so powerful, and I think is really a huge part of the future of financial inclusion. What we need is both a deepening, broadening of it, and Nisha really talked about kind of the broadening, right? This is a market where we've seen the bulk of funding go into a very small subset of markets, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And you put up the stats about energy access. Our analysis right now shows that if we stay on business as usual, about 215 million people who could afford a market rate solution are not going to be able to access one by 2030. And that's the group of people living in particularly a set of what we're just calling hardest to reach markets. And these are markets that are either perceived as too small, too poor, or too risky for many commercial investors and many PAYGo operators to enter into. And that's partly an infrastructure question. I mean, to your point, right, there's infrastructure deficits all over the place. And particularly on mobile money, that can be a significant issue we could talk about. But also, there's the size of the markets themselves often does not facilitate the entry of a large, for example, vertically integrated player to go into this market and to expect to make a return on a foreseeable timeline. And so we accept those obstacles. And if the solution we're looking for, as Marcita said, is no one left behind, we are beginning to structure the capital that does that. And so it requires literally the full expanse of capital as an investor. It's going to require grants to offset the cost of moving into very small or riskier markets. In some cases, it will require equity to share that risk and grow with companies. And it will take a whole lot of debt. At the same time, what are we talking about? We're actually talking about a consumer finance model. We want to scale rapidly and to go down market and reach even poorer customers. And so we need to be very sort of have our eyes wide open in terms of what we're monitoring and tracking along portfolio quality and consumer protection, which in PAYGo are more or less the same thing, right? If people are over indebted products, they're not going to pay, they don't pay. At the same time, incentivizing and making it easier for companies to do what we want them to do, which is to go down market. There is a way to do commercial PAYGo profitably, and there is a way to do PAYGo that reaches everybody. And I don't think those are entirely the same models, and we're cognizant of that. So the subsidies need to be layered in intelligently and carefully, so you're not overly distorting a market. At the same time, we are absolutely willing and are planning on compensating companies that can grow portfolios, can reach people in poverty, and can do so while maintaining sort of healthy repayment rates and healthy consumer protection. So that is very much the future of Acumen, and is a big initiative we are looking and actively raising and looking to work with partners such as NDEV and such as Engie.
Great. That sort of, helps set up my next question around, I know, there's ways to make PAYGo companies like expand PAYGo so that they reach the poor. But within the poor, not all poor are the same, and women are one part of the poor. So maybe we can talk a little bit about women as customers, consumers of PAYGo products, and why there's a need to focus on them specifically. The broad umbrella of saying, okay, we're going to reach everybody. There are certain distinctions about women's energy needs that we need to understand, and maybe I'll ask Marcita to come in here to share a little bit about what they're seeing in terms of the data around solar home system usage.
Okay, thanks, Nisha. Maybe one thing that you said captured also my attention is basically why do we target women with PAYGo? Now, if we leave half of the population, or if you leave a big chunk of the worldwide population even in energy poverty, we cannot expect that social economic development will happen. So I think, and those aspects are very linked. So energy and economic development are two things that sort of go hand in hand. So that's why I think in a bigger sort of scale, and I think I heard a couple of days ago, especially also for development cooperation, where we come from a very sort of public background. We have social contracts with communities that we work with, so we cannot leave those women behind in that sense. Now, wise or the leveraging of the data and the usage of those systems obviously gives companies a better overview on what women want when they design the products. I think we've seen examples where products were designed but not really targeting women. So the marketing.
Sorry, Marcita, you muted yourself accidentally while speaking.
Yep, I'm back. So also the marketing has been pretty much targeting men, and the female population has been a bit left out in that aspect. So we need to first leverage data, know what is the usage. For instance, we know through the different activities that we've done also on household level under, for instance, what we call the last mile results-based financing project, where we target 10,000 households, where we also have partnered with a number of companies. We've seen that actually the needs of the women in the house are not necessarily covered by, let's say, the electrified rooms. So you would see that the cooking area is left dark while the living room is lightened, and etc. So also in the decision-making process, women are not really sort of either they are not aware that they could actually sort of shape it, because it's mostly men that purchase those products. We've seen also data, the ratio of those, the purchase is 70% to 30. So basically it's 70% of male customers versus 30% of female customers. So I think that explains a little bit also why usage is sort of decided by mainly the male family head, and the women are sort of just tagging along and not setting the standards there.
Great, thanks, Marcita. So yeah, this idea of recognizing that women's energy needs within a household are not always prioritized. They're different, they're specific, and what that means for the design of the technologies that are being offered and how they're being used should also be something that is worth considering. I'll go to Allison, and I know you how do you think about women as customers? And that, I know that there's been some discussion around that, the recognition that there is a digital gender gap, and so what is the opportunity you see? As Marcita said, you can't ignore the half the population. You're leaving a big chunk of customers out of the equation, but it's not as easy to reach them either.
Yeah, and I think the PAYGo sector as a whole hasn't really applied a gender lens, because most of the lens that we apply in terms of impact is at the level of a household. And most of the households that we serve do have a mix of a young woman or a young child who may be female in them as well. And so I think maybe there's been a little bit of a narrative that takes for granted the impact downstream that the products have on women, and that those, Marcita brings up a lot of really good points that, if the decision maker is a male, then the decision maker is also going to decide where the lights are installed, most likely, and that may not benefit the woman in the household as much as we might otherwise imagine. So I think there is, not as much of a gender lens in general in the PAYGo sector. I think the major lens has been really on the energy access side and the digital financial services piece, and financial inclusion in general. So really trying to leverage mobile money networks, and digital technology, and then also trying to get better and better at our practices when it comes to credit risk management. And something that does need a little bit of thought is, if we do want more of our registered customers to be women, among the many barriers that come into play in that, in achieving that, are the structural barriers of whether a woman is registered to a credit reference bureau or not, and may or may not have any kind of credit background that may or may not qualify the person to borrow, based on whatever the rules are of the PAYGo provider, or they may not have the knowledge to manage their existing credit reference bureau record if it's not a positive record, et cetera. And maybe a second piece of that would be on their identification. So in these two things combined, right, would be like generally good practice for know your customer, and decision making on who to lend to. Do you actually know the true identity of them using their government issued ID? And what can you say about their past repayment history? And it's just generally true, and in some countries even more stark than in others, that women are less likely to have these forms of identification and less likely to be registered to the Credit Reference Bureau, and have a record and history. There are a lot of other challenges that we could layer on top of that as well, but just starting with those two things, which would be good practice in responsible financial services, may also accidentally be limiting the ability to help build that kind of a track record for women in the PAYGo space.
Yeah, it seems to be a problem everywhere that, this lack of focus on or recognition of women as a specific segment. And then even within that, understanding that there's a whole different set of preferences, needs. So maybe starting to move away from these more gender neutral approaches, and embedding a gender lens could be a good starting point to recognize and realize the opportunity that this segment presents. I wanted to add, I saw Dan vigorously nodding at a lot of what Alison was saying in terms of the lack of a gender focus within the PAYGo sector, and what some of the challenges around the lack of data are. So, as an impact investor in this space, what do you see as some opportunities for, the kinds of companies you invest in, and what are some of the issues that you think need to be tackled by the sector?
Yeah, in terms of opportunities, they're massive, which is partly a factor of the fact that they've been relatively tapped, right? And in analysis we did internally at this point with 60 Decibels, looking across an impact monitoring firm that began at Acumen and has since spun out and is standalone now. They looked across over 300 companies in their database to try and look at gender disaggregated data. And almost half of the companies in the database had to be removed from the analysis because they simply either didn't have enough data or didn't serve anywhere, either less than 50 women or less than 50% of their customer base were women. And so that just tells you, that's almost half the sample size gone just before we even got started. Once we see that the impact is great, it's actually somewhat small, but statistically significantly greater for women across the entire sort of database, particularly in financial inclusion, but that we are unable to track that for a huge number of companies. So there's opportunities abound for both better data collection, better analysis. And then, yeah, we have invested in, I would say, an embarrassingly small, but hopefully it'll grow, number of companies that really do focus on designing products for women. And they've been some of our most impactful investments to date. Burn Manufacturing is the largest clean cook stove company in the world. And their stoves have been designed with really robust customer feedback mechanisms, seeing how women use them, respond to them, what they feel like how they work, what the actual time and fuel savings are, and have been really rigorous about then implementing them and iterating products and designing. And we've seen that pay off for them. We've also seen it pay off because they're getting and able to leverage carbon finance, right? And other people are paying for the impact that they're creating. We're all paying for it in some ways, in a way that can drive affordability and can really make these products viable. And so there's huge opportunities to make products more affordable, to monetize the impact we want to see. Carbon's the first example of this, I think, really, but I'd love to see a lot more, and for us to be more intentional about, similar to what I described earlier, sort of incentivizing and paying companies who are willing to go farther down market. In terms of the issues, yeah, the sales force is a huge one, in terms of, the agent for the companies, but Allison hit on a couple of the issues. The barriers are structural, right? I mean, we're asking companies to sell into societies and family units as they are, and there's only so much they can do to push that along. And so having, I think, a larger number of women in those force and being able to sell and sort of consider women as customers, having the right products is all part of it. Even for cook stoves, we see a lot of times the financial decision is still made by the male head of the household, who often doesn't perhaps value the impact that it creates quite as much as the women might, or that we might like to see them. And so we can push forward, but there's just huge amounts of work to do on kind of market sensitization around different products and around the different impacts they can have. And I think we see that take off in a number of places once people get it, but it does take that sort of market activation work for a lot of these things.
And Marcita, this is something the demand creation side of, and awareness building that NDEV has also done as a part of its, as you're stimulating the supply, focusing also on creating awareness, because these are new technologies and often require some level of moving away from how you've done things for, in certain communities for hundreds of years. If you could just touch upon that a little bit.
Thank you, Nisha. I was actually, I really wanted to add something to that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. So basically, we had Uganda-wide campaign, Chusa and Pumbayo, looking on cook stoves, where women were the central piece of this aspect. So it was basically women using the products. Part of this marketing activity was really to also understand, go on ground, how do women use the products, how do they, basically what do they value, what do they think from a design perspective does not make sense for them. We matched that feedback then with cook stove producers. So we have really tried to sort of do a little bit more awareness on the demand side and get the feedback from the users. Now on the supply side bit, we are designing new results-based financing. We're programming new not new projects, but new interventions, where we want to also incentivize sales to women. So on the cook stoves bit, but also for the solar companies. So under one of our RBFs that will kick in soon, we want to give the companies a top-up of what they receive, an incentive of 10% if the sale is made to a woman in the household. And also on the cook stove side, there the top-up is a bit higher, since also the cook stoves are from a purchasing perspective are not as expensive. So there we add even 30% additional per improved cook stove sale. So we really want to see if that pushes companies a bit to really take women as to supply them basically and sell to them, and look at it a little bit more with what Alison also mentioned with the gender lens. Not sure on if it trickles all the way down to the agent structure, but that's another topic. Yeah.
Great. So you're going to have some good data to share with us, and hopefully some good results from this results-based financing. And I think that, sort of sets, one of the things that we're speaking here to an audience that's mainly focused on financial inclusion and is very well aware of some of the challenges, Alison, you mentioned, and all of you agreed, in terms of a prerequisite, so to speak, for PAYGo is access to digital technologies, and the digital gender gap means that, it makes it so much harder for women. But it's also like, financial inclusion stakeholders are working on some of these structural issues, but it's also a fundamental piece of expanding the PAYGo market. So where do we see opportunities to address these challenges and come together, and what is needed to address some of these structural issues? And in my head, it's like, of course we should be working together, and that's why we're having this conversation today. But I think bringing it a little bit more concrete and hearing from each of you might be helpful. So I don't know who wants to go first. I don't want to call upon one person right now. So. Okay, maybe I should. It's easier that way. So I'll I'll ask Alison.
Okay, great. Yeah, so where to start on this one? I think on the side of the PAYGo companies, something that we do, really try to practically work towards is inclusivity overall. So I kind of drew a pretty black and white line around whether you have a credit reference bureau record and whether you have a government ID or not. But if we're going to talk about inclusive finance for the energy sector, you do have to actually kind of have something that goes around those very strict requirements. So I think, learning, getting lessons within the PAYGo space that come from general financial services in terms of what requirements will and won't be inclusive from a gender perspective, and what what sales channels will and won't be inclusive from a gender perspective. There's a lot to just draw from microfinance and plenty of other PAYGo providers, in fact, who have been extremely successful, as Dan has said. So I think drawing from what has worked well, learning from what has worked well is a very good starting point to build the interest within the PAYGo sector for having a gender lens. Talking about, what are the benefits of working with customers who are the registered customers being female? What are the benefits of having a product that has a compelling use case for the woman head of household, or the woman who is the primary user of the product in the household? Talking more about it, I think, is a good starting point for sure. There will definitely be a path to support, like Marcita was talking about, which would be helpful to the nudges, and the reward systems are always helpful in making sure that attention is paid, and that there is some traction on the topic. Potentially, in general, I think reaching the most vulnerable people does require some consideration of grants and subsidies. It may not be commercially viable, and it's very difficult for a company like NG to and for all of PAYGo companies really to with the limited resources that we have, and the big challenge that we have around energy inclusivity, to also try to direct our finite resources towards addressing gender inclusivity when it's more costly and even more challenging. So having some subsidies and some grants that support that kind of activity, I think is very, very helpful. And I think that's a pretty good start. One thing that's generally helpful for the types of products that we can bring in and the impact that they can have We started the session talking about what productive use can mean for adaptability and mitigating climate impact, et cetera. I think from a product side, we just have a lot of work to do on getting the costs to the level where the price makes sense to the customer, whoever that customer is, from whatever vulnerable and lower income segment they might be from. Right now, a lot of those products are just simply cost prohibitive for any person of any gender. So when we want to get to those more sophisticated types of products and solutions, we really do need to look at what can we do in terms of the design of the product, the supply chain, the funding for that supply chain, et cetera, if we want to get that product financed and in the hands of more vulnerable consumers.
Thanks, Allison. One thing I'll push back a little bit that might be a lesson learned for PAYGo companies or in the financial inclusion world is, as we're getting more data and financial inclusion about how women are better customers, that builds the business case. If we had data, sex disaggregated data in PAYGo, we might be able to make that argument, but I don't think it exists. So I'll maybe Dan can talk a little bit more about some of this, because I know he straddles both worlds, has been in the financial inclusion space for a while. So what do you see as opportunities and in your role as an investor?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I forgot to mention I used to work for CGAP and collaborated with Allison and NG and formerly Phoenix before that long ago. We need growth for starters, right? If we want this to reach everyone, inclusivity, we're expanding this model rapidly. And so, I mean, that's the work that we and many others are eagerly pursuing, right? Is expanding the pay-as-you-go solar model to many more markets with all the sort of caveats that Allison and I previously talked about, and deepening it. And so more productive use products that are viable and can be financed either at a business level, more additional financial services, the sort of things that NG does with its education finance, and all sorts of products like that. At the same time, we need, I think to Allison's point about learning from microfinance, there needs to be a lot more, I think, well-structured technical assistance, particularly around I'll flatter a little bit here, just having gotten to work with Allison in the past. Not all PAYGo companies are so lucky to have somebody with a background in financial inclusion and microfinance and managing a loan book like that. And it's really hard to build a credit department on the fly as you are learning how to pitch and sell a physical product. And so I have found that the TA that can be provided by donors is relatively low cost in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we're talking funding consultants for $25,000, $30,000 that can have huge knock-on effects and can be leveraged, and there can be more learning. We were able to do that while I was at CGAP. I think there's a need for more of it. And that ties right in with the needs around consumer protection, right? The credit risk and consumer protection are always going to be hand in glove in this space. And I think, GOGLA, the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, is doing huge work to fund better consumer protection surveys through 60 decibels and better consumer protection assessments through MFR as well. I think we can scale those up. I think there's a lot more there. And the last piece, and I haven't thought this all the way through, so I'm just going to kind of brainstorm on this session a little bit live. As an investor, one of the biggest challenges I see us having is layering all these lenses together in terms of gender, inclusivity, and climate, particularly when we think about these things together. And so figuring out how to prioritize, how to think about all of them at once with an investment, how to support our investees without what it is right now, which is kind of an overwhelming burden of requirements, potential grants, but with often not well thought out requirements. And so if we can be a bit more cohesive and holistic and less burdensome, I think we'll get better outcomes.
Yeah, I'm sure Allison agrees with that. Marcita, I know we have only a few minutes left, but I wanted to get your perspective as a development cooperation project in terms of the role. I think Endev is already doing a lot of the demonstration case, but what other opportunities to build this sector and with this focus on women? Where do you see opportunities and the role of, development actors in that space?
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. I believe that incentivizing companies is not enough. I have a strong feeling that demand side subsidies might help, specifically if we put a female lens on it. So if we can think around also smart ways to approach it, as I think Dan mentioned, that really the ways we approach it need to be sort of also coordinated, especially in the donor space, to also see real impact and I think not only piloting some of the aspects, but really scaling through demand side subsidies, reaching a bigger number of women, but also what I believe, and maybe this is not necessarily from a development partner perspective, but also thinking about delivery of models. So maybe selling to a woman a food system might not be the silver bullet. Maybe energy as a service might. So basically trying out approaches and not only doing business as usual. I think I've talked a couple of days ago with a solar company that applied that model, not necessarily to women, but for sure to poor communities. And that had worked well actually for them. So this is like my 5 cents a little bit to that aspect.
Great. I realize we have to wrap up soon. Thank you for your perspectives. I hope we answered some of the questions that were coming in, because I know that I was looking at them and I know we had them sort of covered, so I didn't refer to specific questions. But I think my takeaway as somebody who comes from the financial inclusion world and has been dabbling at this intersection of financial inclusion and access to renewable energy technologies as a way to address, outcomes for women and climate change, there's a huge opportunity, but it's going to require work. This is still PAYGo, it seems like, has been around for a long time, but it's not that long. So there is a lot more opportunity to learn over there. And the private sector has a role to play, but it's not going to be able to get to where it needs to go by itself. There's a very important role for development organizations to support innovations and testing. And we're talking about a green, just transition that might require subsidies. In this case, it's probably not a bad thing to be able to then think about models that help people realize greater opportunities. So thinking about smart subsidies, investors incentivizing and investing in private companies to change their behavior, development organizations supporting the demand creation, and overall, collectively, this is a problem we all face. So we have to work on this together. And it's not an either or. It's not climate change or gender equality. It has to be an integrated approach. Otherwise, we'll be leaving about half of the population of the world behind. So with that, I would like to thank my panelists, and I would like to thank the Financial Inclusion Week team for all their support. And if you have questions, please reach out, and we'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.